Welcome to Chapter 4. In this chapter, we'll discuss ethics and corporate social responsibility. As multinationals expand beyond borders and do business in different cultures and different societies, they might be exposed to additional and more complex ethical dilemmas. Companies can suffer significant bad publicity for violating ethical principles. This can hurt their reputation and cost them their customers' goodwill and trust. Losses can also be incurred when companies face lawsuits as a result of unethical conduct and are subject to fines. Ethisphere International is an organization that publishes an annual list of the most ethical companies around the world. The 2022 honoree list of most ethical companies included 136 organizations, some of which you might recognize if you visit Ethisphere's homepage. Ethical questions become increasingly important when multinationals operate in developing countries where regulations or laws are not as strongly enforced or even existent like they are in developed countries. Multinational managers also face significant pressures to deliver results and meet high performance expectations. This can put additional pressure on individuals to cut corners or ignore local rules and policies. Multinationals also have very significant resources when operating in developing countries. This limits host governments' ability to regulate the actions of multinationals. Sometimes host governments are not very motivated to regulate these actions because they depend on the foreign direct investment that multinationals bring. Every multinational company is going to face ethical challenges when operating in foreign countries. In this chapter, we're going to try to understand how multinationals can handle different challenging scenarios, like the one on this slide. Business ethics are a part of the broader concern for ethical behavior affecting people and their welfare. Organizations are mostly driven by an economic logic, their need to turn a profit. But multinationals must understand that their business decisions impact people as well. Internal stakeholders like employees or customers or suppliers, as well as external stakeholders like community members or the environment in which the business exists. Companies must recognize that every business decision has consequences for people. Whether these outcomes are intended or not, organizations' decisions will impact organizational members as well as other external stakeholders. And so when multinationals make decisions, they must factor in the outcomes of their decisions beyond the economic benefit for the company and also the impact that those decisions have on other human beings beyond the organization's boundaries. While ethics in the domestic domain are certainly important, the international business arena represents some unique and very challenging ethical problems. International business is a lot more complex because not all cultures agree on what one should do or what is considered ethical behaviors. Multinationals often have a lot of power and assets that are sometimes equal to those of foreign governments of the countries in which they do business, which gives them significant power and raises additional concerns for how that power is used. Things that multinational organizations must think of in terms of their practices in foreign countries are practices within the organization. For example, discriminatory work practices, unsafe work practices, respect of workers' rights. Multinationals also have to pay attention to corporate behavior, things like corruption, fraud, misrepresentation, conflict of interest, or payments for more favorable treatments like bribes. Multinationals also pay attention to intellectual property rights. Many countries have weak IP protections or lack of enforcement, which is another ethical concern. Finally, organizations also consider social and environmental impact of their actions. What are their market practices? How is their presence in a particular country or market creating social inequality? What are the potential adverse environmental impacts by the business, like pollution? All of these aspects are things that must be considered when conducting business internationally. Corporate social responsibility is a concept closely related to ethics. Corporate social responsibility refers to the idea that business has a responsibility to society beyond making a profit. Corporate social responsibility is concerned with the ethical consequences of company policies and procedures. And companies that practice corporate social responsibility are companies that take the welfare and interests of various stakeholders into account. When we think about stakeholders of the organization, we tend to think about primarily internal stakeholders, or what your textbook refers to as primary stakeholders. Those are your employees of all hierarchical levels, so both line employees and managers, your suppliers, your customers, and of course the shareholders, the individuals who have invested money in the company. Note that there's a difference between stakeholder and shareholder. A shareholder is one type of stakeholder. But when we think about stakeholders, we have to look beyond the organizational boundaries and think about secondary stakeholders. Those include potentially environmental groups or other NGOs that are affected by the company's actions or try to protect affected groups, local governments, different social groups, and the communities in which the business operates. Addressing the needs of all stakeholders is critical. One good example is Tom's Shoes. You might be familiar with this company and its 1-for-1 model. For every pair of shoes that is purchased, Tom's will donate a second pair of shoes to people in need in developing countries. When we think about Tom's Shoes, we tend to frame their actions as a social venture, a venture that exists with a social objective in mind, to do good. If we try to think about the stakeholders of Tom's Shoes, we will think about the employees who work for the company, the suppliers who supply them with raw materials, maybe the people who invested in the company, and the customers who buy the shoes, as well as the individuals who receive the free shoes. But in order to fully understand the context of the company's business, we also have to think about secondary stakeholders, which are often not considered. In the case of Tom's Shoes, secondary stakeholders are, for example, shoe manufacturers in the countries in which Tom's Shoes is giving shoes away. Those individuals are clearly negatively impacted by Tom's Shoes' actions. Another consideration is how the shoes are distributed. In many countries, Tom's Shoes distributes shoes through Christian charities, which means that individuals who do not practice Christianity are excluded and do not receive the same kind of support from the organization, which can contribute to growing social inequality in host countries. So while we tend to think about the primary stakeholders more easily, we have to spend more time and more carefully consider the situation to also identify secondary stakeholders and make sure that we factor in how our company's actions influence them. Your textbook offers a brief overview of ethical philosophy and two traditional ethical views, the teleological ethical view and the deontological ethical view. The teleological ethical theory argues that the morality of an act comes from its consequences. The action is considered ethical if it delivers the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is a utilitarian worldview. What is good and moral is what produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. When Roche Pharma, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, tested medicine on organs of executed Chinese prisoners, they engaged, or they put the teleological ethical theory into use by arguing that using these organs allowed them to test medicine and develop new medicine that would deliver the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The deontological ethical approach argues that actions have good or bad morality in and of themselves, regardless of their outcomes. And so the deontological view argued that using organs from executed prisoners is unethical because it is morally wrong, regardless of why we engage in this action. So you can see how these two perspectives are quite opposite and can lead to very different conclusions. Your textbook also offers some moral languages that are used to describe the ways in which people think about ethical decisions. The first one is virtue or vice. This again is aligned with the previous discussion and the notion that if the intention of the action was virtuous, then it is considered ethical. The self-control language discusses how individuals manage their thoughts and actions. Maximizing human welfare is aligned with the utilitarian view, again, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Avoiding harm focuses on the consequences of the actions rather than the intent of the actions, which is the virtue and vice approach. Here, the emphasis is on avoiding negative consequences. The fifth approach is rights and duties, which is aligned with the legalistic view of ethics. This approach argues that one has the obligation to fulfill one's duties and respect the rights of others, meaning follow and adhere to local laws. The last one is the social contract, which is aligned with ethical relativism. This argument that what is ethical in a particular context or a particular society should be considered ethical. We will revisit these ideas a little bit later in this lecture to see how they apply to different ethical decision-making tools. One of the reasons that ethical decision-making in the global arena is so much more complex than in the domestic arena is due to national differences in culture and in social institutions that affect how business is run and how ethical behaviors and corporate social responsibility is perceived. For example, in Chapter 2, we will discuss culture. Societies that are high in achievement orientation, highly individualistic, highly universalist, and have high materialism are related to higher likelihood of deviance from the norms, from ethical standards. Local institutions, social institutions, which are discussed in Chapter 3, might also impact ethical decision-making and the degree to which individuals deviate from norms or socially acceptable behaviors. Social institutions like high industrialization or capitalist systems, lower family breakdown, those are also related to higher deviance from norms. This is explained by institutional anomy theory, which argues that national cultures and social institutions are more likely to encourage breaking ethical norms and justifying ethically suspect behaviors in certain cultures. One key consideration in international business is the use of bribery and special payments. In many countries, such payments are expected, and people routinely offer gifts and bribes. It's clear from the fact that there is a word for bribe in almost every language in the world. In the US, we might refer to them as grease payments, kickbacks, or gifts. In Mexico, they are referred to as mordida. In the Middle East, as bakshish. Every country has some form of way to describe these types of payments. Like the US and the European Union, many countries have laws prohibiting such corrupt practices, but it is very difficult to enforce. Corruption and bribery can have very negative outcomes for societies. When corruption is prevalent in a particular society, this means that individuals or citizens will receive poorer quality goods or materials, because when companies pay a bribe in order to gain a contract, they are going to recover the cost of the bribe by raising the price of the contract or by using lower quality goods for manufacturing or infrastructure or whatever the project entails. And so it ends up hurting the citizens of the country in which corruption is prevalent. This also means that goods and services are more expensive. Corruption undermines free competition and creates an unfair marketplace in which smaller companies cannot successfully compete. This discourages entrepreneurship. And of course, corruption can also result in collusion among firms, resulting in even higher prices. Transparency International publishes an annual Corruption Perceptions Index, which indicates the level of corruption in different countries around the world, from very clean to highly corrupt. If you visit transparency.org, you can see the different rankings of countries around the world. Any country can be selected, and you can see the score that it receives. For example, Finland's score in 2021 was 88 out of 100, which means it's a very clean country. 100 is the highest score, and it ranks first out of 180 countries. If you look at the United States score, it ranks 67 out of 100, so also fairly clean, above average, and it ranks 27th in the world out of 180 countries, so also towards the top, considered somewhat more clean. In 1977, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was set into law in the United States, forbidding corrupt practices. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act forbids U.S. companies to make or offer illegal payments, like bribes, to foreign government officials for the sake of getting or retaining business. A firm has the possibility of being liable if it should have known about the actions of its subsidiaries. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act applies to both companies and individuals. Both companies and individuals can be held liable and pay a fine or even serve prison time if found that one has engaged in corrupt practices like bribery. In the 1980s, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was amended, and it now differentiates between a bribe and a facilitation payment. A facilitation payment is a payment made in order to speed up normal business. For example, paying a government official to do something that he or she would have done anyway, just do it faster, is no longer considered criminal under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act also excludes any kind of payments that needed to be made to avoid injury or violence. Of course, multinationals can have their own corporate code of conduct, which also rules out any kind of facilitation payment. Even though this is no longer considered illegal, many multinationals still consider these types of payments to be unethical. Transnational trading blocs like NAFTA or the European Union create more pressure for convergence or uniformity in ethical standards. And many multinationals seek to put in place an ethical standard that would apply to their global operations. 3 principles that can be very useful for multinationals in these contexts are avoiding harm, respecting rights and duties, and respecting the social contract. Avoiding harm refers to avoiding harm to various stakeholders, both primary and secondary stakeholders. For example, avoiding harm to employees, ensuring employees have safe working conditions, but also avoiding harm to the environment in which the organization operates in, because harmful emissions to the air or to local waterways can hurt the local population. Respecting rights and duties refers to the respect that organizations must pay to the rights of various stakeholders. Yes, the organization has the right to turn a profit, but it must at the same time also preserve its duty to employees and provide them with a safe working environment, a living wage, appropriate safety gear, and so on. The final principle is respecting the social contract in the foreign location, meaning abiding by all local laws and local values regarding ethical conduct. Your textbook also lists additional sources for international ethics guidelines, and many of these bodies, while they do not have the authority to enforce ethical conduct, they offer many principles that can be useful for organizations to draw up their own codes of conduct. Exhibit 4.9 in your textbook offers a sample of a code of conduct for a potential multinational. Codes of conduct might include things that involve around respecting basic human rights and freedoms, maintaining high standards, and avoiding involvement in local politics, issues around technology transfer, environmental protection, consumer protection, and employment practices. When faced with an ethical dilemma, leaders might rely on one of these 4 principles. The first one is ethical relativism. This refers to each society's views on ethics and how those should be integrated into making ethical decisions. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. For example, in some societies, assisted suicide is considered ethical. And even if it's not considered as such in our own society, we should respect that in the foreign society. Ethical universalism is the opposite of ethical relativism. This view argues that there are basic moral principles that transcend cultural and national boundaries. This perspective might argue that assisted suicide is always wrong and should not be tolerated regardless of the location. One of the problematic aspects of ethical relativism is that it can very quickly deteriorate, so to speak, into convenient relativism, where companies use the argument of ethical relativism to do things that are beneficial for the organizations themselves. For example, arguing that given that child labor is not illegal and not considered unethical in a particular host country, then it would be okay for the multinational to employ children at a lower wage because it will help the multinational reduce costs and be more profitable. This is convenient relativism and not ethical relativism. The problem with ethical relativism is that it can become convenient relativism. However, we also have to avoid extreme moral universalism. If we use the same example of child labor, extreme moral universalism would ignore local customs. For example, in many developing nations, families depend on the income that children can bring to the family unit in order to survive. And so practicing extreme moral universalism and eliminating all child labor within a foreign subsidiary could end up hurting the local population. So how do we make decisions when faced with an ethical dilemma? We have to factor in these 3 points of view. First of all, does my decision make economic sense? I have an obligation to my shareholders, which are my primary stakeholders or part of my primary stakeholders, and I have an obligation to them that my decisions will make business sense. But making money does not guarantee ethical conduct. And so I have to also engage in legal analysis and make sure that my decisions meet the legal requirements of both the host and the parent organizations. But still, if something is not explicitly prohibited by law, does not necessarily mean that it's ethical. And so we also need to conduct an ethical analysis and focus beyond the legal requirements and beyond the financial considerations and think about what is the right thing to do. Multinationals are guests in other nations, and their actions will impact their host country and its citizens. And so, in order to ensure ethical conduct, multinationals have to think about the organization, the societal culture in which the organization operates, and the personal and ethical beliefs of the organization. Your textbook lists some best practices that can be used in order to ensure ethical conduct. One first step that organizations should engage in is draw up a code of conduct. And in order for that code of conduct to be meaningful, employees must be trained on what the code of conduct means and how it is enforced. And of course, consequences must be put in place for individuals who violate the code of conduct. Another thing that organizations can do is have senior leaders act as role models and make sure that senior leaders suffer the same consequences for violating the code of conduct as do line employees. In order to make sure that the code of conduct respects local customs, it would be important to consult with local stakeholders when drawing up the code of conduct. All employees should be held accountable and follow the guidelines within the code of conduct. It is not just the responsibility of senior managers or employees in the finance and legal department. Every single employee should be trained and have a sense of ownership of ensuring ethical conduct within the organization. Of course, at the corporate level, leaders should set realistic performance targets to avoid putting excessive pressure on managers, which might lead them to cut corners. Organizations should look at how results were accomplished and not just what was accomplished. Your textbook provides a chart that could help in determining whether an action is considered ethical or not. But again, many of the decisions that multinational managers will face will not be easy, will not have a black or white answer. For example, should we allow child labor in a country that doesn't have a minimum employment age? In the United States, there's a minimum employment age, and employers cannot employ underage individuals. And even those who meet the minimum age requirements have some significant protections and limitations on how many hours they can work. And so, should we enforce these standards in a foreign location? This might be aligned with ethical absolutism, this belief that there are certain principles that should apply in all situations. But in some countries, children are relied upon to support the family, for example, during harvest time when all hands are needed in the fields, or when families depend on the income generated by children in order to survive. And so these types of questions do not always have a clear-cut answer, which is why international ethics are so complex and challenging. To summarize, multinational managers will face ethical dilemmas and will have to make decisions that have an ethical element to them. The challenges that multinational managers face are magnified by the complexity of working across different countries and cultures and different institutional contexts. Those will influence what is considered ethical or unethical. While we see some convergence and some uniformity in what is considered ethical or unethical around the world, there are still significant differences between countries. In order to be efficient and effective decision makers, global managers must familiarize themselves with the host country culture and be very well versed in the corporate code of conduct when making decisions that impact the organization and other stakeholders.